Okay, I was supposed to talk about a problem from my doctoral research, but I'm not going to do that. Luckily, we've already started talking about what I'm going to talk about. If necessary, or if people prefer, I can talk about my doctoral research afterwards, but I'm going to talk about this first at least. I think it's relevant to the spirit of the workshop, even if it's not what my doctoral research is on. And I'm going to mostly read because otherwise I will get carried away, and you have to be careful about that. Um, to be honest, I haven't been able to focus on my doctoral research for the last few weeks anyway, so it would be difficult for me to present on it today. I have been, like most people, watching what many are now calling a genocide take place day after day, watching it, witnessing, listening, reading articles, watching reports, emailing, organizing, messaging, marching, arguing, and thinking. And alongside this, at the same time, I've had to spend, or rather waste, hours and hours trying to understand why I am not supposed to talk about this. Why in Vienna I am not supposed to organize, not supposed to march, not supposed to write about it or learn about it. And this is some one thing that I am not supposed to just say what I see. I'm not supposed to say this is wrong, and I'm certainly not supposed to say this looks like a genocide. We all know what hangs over this. We've already mentioned it. Anyone making any criticism of the actions of the Israeli government will be accused of anti-Semitism. And that is rightly a very serious allegation. We must, especially here, in a place where anti-Semitic atrocities are not nearly distant enough historically or geographically, we must be extremely vigilant in identifying and preventing anti-Semitism. But the problem here and now is getting that right, and those stakes are extremely high. It is difficult to prevent something you can neither define nor recognize. And as many Jewish scholars and organizations have by now pointed out, assuming that any and all criticism of the Israeli state policies or actions is necessarily an expression of anti-Semitism is dangerous in at least two ways. First of all, it immunizes that state's policies and actions from any criticism. And second, it makes it harder to identify and prevent actual cases of anti-Semitism. Again and again in the past month, the University of Vienna has issued the statement that there is no room at this university for anti-Semitism, racism, etc. It has issued the same statement while cancelling a scheduled talk called Palestine from Feminist Perspectives last week, clearly implying that the talk or the speaker was anti-Semitic. So at this point, we have to ask, what does the University of Vienna even mean by anti-Semitism? Where does this university stand on the Jerusalem Declaration? Where do they stand on the 2018 open letter by over 40 international Jewish organizations explicitly condemning, equating anti-Semitism with criticism of the Israeli government policies? Where do they stand on the voices of countless Jewish scholars, academics, community leaders, and organizations who have been at pains in the last 4 weeks to make this distinction? Criticism of the Israeli government or criticism of Israel itself can be motivated by anti-Semitism. Of course it can. Just as criticism of Saudi Arabia can be motivated by Islamophobia. Is it possible to criticize human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia without being Islamophobic? I think quite clearly it can. How to finish a sentence. I think we should be able to make the same distinction when we speak about Israel, and I don't think this is a radical claim. The following are not radical claims either, although I find they begin to sound really radical where I am lately. Israel's establishment of settlements in Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation under international law. That's not radical, that's actually a quote from the UN Security Council. The 16-year Israeli siege of Gaza is illegal under international humanitarian law. In extensive long-term reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli Jewish humanitarian organization B'Tselem have all defined the conditions in Israel and occupied Palestine as an apartheid. In fact, as Mehdi Hassan pointed out in 2021, multiple Israeli government ministers have themselves described it as an apartheid. Yet to stand in the University of Vienna right now and say Israel is an apartheid state feels like a very dangerous thing to do. It's a big word, apartheid, I know this. The question is whether or not we should be allowed to use it. In that article in 2021, Hassan wrote, "You can, of course, agree or disagree in good faith with the claim that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid, but it is not anti-Semitic. Apartheid is not an insult or a trope, It is a crime against humanity clearly defined under international law. It wasn't anti-Christian to condemn South Africa for apartheid policies and practices in the 1980s. And it isn't anti-Jewish to condemn Israel for what many believe to be an apartheid policies and practices today. So what about genocide? I opened by saying we are watching a genocide. It is a deeply emotive term, rendered even more so when used in this context because the formalization of its use and the current 5-point UN definition of genocide grew out of the Nazi extermination programs in World War II. The primary association with the word genocide for many people may well be that unique horror of the Holocaust or the Shoah. Its use in the context of any Jewish community is understandably difficult, but this should again compel us to understand the difference between criticizing Israeli government and criticizing or condemning Jewish people. These stakes are high. But as with apartheid, genocide is a term with specific use in international law, one which is intended to help us identify a particular and especially egregious crime. In 1946, the UN said, genocide is a denial of the right of existence for an entire human group. Such denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind, results in great losses to humanity in the form of cultural and other contributions represented by these human groups. Many instances of crimes such crimes of genocide have occurred when racial, religious, political, and other groups have been destroyed entirely or in part. The term genocide has since been applied in many different contexts that I'm sure many of you will be aware of: Rwanda, Bosnia, Armenia, Darfur, Cambodia. It is now used by the UN and the ICC based on the following 5 criteria, specifying any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Those 5 points are: 1, killing members of the group; 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group; 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part; 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group; and 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, an article titled "A Textbook Case of Genocide" was published by Jewish Currents on October 13th. In it, Raz Segal, who is an Israeli genocide and Holocaust scholar, argues that at that point, in mid-October, the Israeli siege of and bombardment of Gaza fulfilled the first 3 criteria for genocide. It now fulfills 4. And further, that the intent to destroy was clearly stated by the Israeli government in advance. Thousands more civilians, among them thousands of babies and children, have been killed since that article was written, and by now Raz Segal is far from the only one using this term. Just yesterday, 3 human rights groups filed a petition with the ICC charging Israel with apartheid and genocide. Now, as with Mehdi Hassan's comments on apartheid, you can, of course, in most countries, agree or disagree in good faith with the claim that Israel is guilty of the crime of genocide. Let's have that conversation. But it is not anti-Semitic to make that argument. Genocide might be a highly emotive and contentious term, especially for Jewish communities. But as with apartheid, it is not an insult or a trope. It is a crime clearly defined under international law. So if those speaking on behalf of the University of Vienna cannot tell the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of a government, if they do not endorse or understand the purpose and legitimacy of UN resolutions, if they reject reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and if they cannot understand the basics of international law, one wonders what the hell qualifies them to run a university. They do not speak for me. I know they do not speak for many students, staff, and colleagues at this institution, yet they have created an environment in which any attempt to object to the current open public massacre of thousands of civilians is rendered suspect. They cancel this talk on Palestine by an academic reporting nothing but documented fact on Palestine, not only with the comment that no anti-Semitism would be tolerated at the university and the obvious implication thereof, but with the comment that they would investigate how this event came to be planned and make sure it didn't happen again. They rightly express sympathy for the relatives of those affected by Hamas attacks, but they say nothing about the relatives of the now more than 10,000 Palestinian civilians killed since then. They say nothing about the 11 out of 14 universities in Gaza which have been bombed to rubble in less than a month. Epistemicide, we know, is a part of genocide. No comment about the lives of our colleagues and students at those universities. This university is not at odds with the state of Vienna in any of this. It is on the same page. The feminist perspectives on Palestine talk went ahead at CEU, and as we've already mentioned, the police arrived, warning that they were there in case anyone made incendiary statements. Every week, our protests, our marches, candlelight vigils are banned by the police. When they occur, they are reported in the media as being in support of Hamas. I have been there every weekend, and they are not. In fact, they are the only place in Vienna I have felt in the last month like I am not losing my mind. I have spoken to students and academics in the past few weeks trying to understand the relative silence, trying to understand how people can speak and write publicly on other atrocities, on other injustices, on other forms of racism and colonialism and violence, but not on this. It has not been total silence. I am grateful for the very strong statement signed by the staff and students at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology here at Uni Wien, and for their work organising the teach-in. I'm grateful for the petition from students at the Academy for Fine Arts in Vienna, the statement by and activism from staff and students at Central European University, especially the Gender Studies Department, and the recent open letter by the South-South Collective in support of CEU. They have all taken risks in speaking out and organising and writing public statements, and these risks are increased without the support of their academic colleagues. Over the last few weeks, I have been told that people will not speak because they don't want to offend their supervisors, because they have a job opportunity they might lose out on, they don't want to upset their friends, and all of this repeatedly because people will not speak because they will be portrayed as anti-Semitic. Not that they believe calling for a ceasefire or objecting to Israeli government actions is anti-Semitic, but that it will be portrayed as anti-Semitic, and that this will affect their jobs, their relationships, and their prospects. I appreciate those conversations, and they have helped me to understand the social and political climate here, which I admit is very different to what I'm used to. I have been advised repeatedly not to say genocide, not to say apartheid. Not that the situation is not genocide or is not apartheid, but that I should not say it is. It has been difficult and confusing to hear this reasoning from academics in particular who are otherwise so well able to explain their positions and their reasoning. I don't understand it. I don't understand it. I do not want any job, any position, or any relationship which requires my complicity in genocide. Do we see 2 million people intentionally and explicitly denied food, water, electricity, fuel, and medical supplies, and then bombed in hospitals and schools, nurses and families and journalists, bombed in refugee camps and in ambulances, bombed while fleeing, bombed at home in their beds? Do we see this and say nothing? Do we watch teenage boys in flip-flops combing through rubble for the bodies of infants and worry about how our reputations will be affected if we say this is wrong? This has to stop. Those who speak for the University of Vienna, those who speak for Vienna, have created an environment in which I accept many people are afraid to speak publicly or write in defense of Palestinian lives. I know the threat of censure, the threat of reputational attack is high. I also accept that I come from a vastly different historical and political background that no doubt makes it more difficult for me to understand how this threat of censure could be so effective when this atrocity is right in our faces and we have the power to do something about it. I admit, I accept that I don't understand, but I feel we have a responsibility to speak.